All right, friends, we're here with one of my favorite people, and I say that with all sincerity because growing up in a Christian home where I learned apologetics, it always made sense to me. I thought it was true. Never really had any doubts. When I got into college, had some real doubts and questions about my faith. And J.P. Moreland, who's with us, was one of the key people in person and through his books that really helped me make sense of my faith and find answers to it. He is a friend, he is a mentor, a colleague at Biola, a distinguished professor, and joins us today because we're going to do something different. We've had you on, JP, to talk about evidence for the soul. We've had you on to do a live Q&A with tough questions about the faith. But today what we're going to do is get a little bit of a behind-the-scenes look at your life, about the people, the experiences, and the books that have shaped your life. So thanks for carving out the time to come on.
Well, I'd always like to be with you, my friend. You're a dear brother and colleague at the university, and we're fellow soldiers. And I'm just honored to be able to share my heart with our brothers and sisters watching, and those who maybe aren't Christians. And so, thanks for inviting me. I'm looking forward to it.
Well, yeah, this is a real treat. Let me start by asking your story to faith. I know you didn't grow up in a Christian home. What was that moment where you became a believer?
Well, I was born in Kansas City, Missouri, and raised in a small town, Grandview, south of Kansas City, and attended a fairly liberal United Methodist church, but I didn't know it was. But Jesus was kind of presented to me as a middle America white guy that kind of had some really good values. And I admit I was attracted to him in the Gospels, but I was too busy playing sports, and I didn't really care about church. Went to the University of Missouri, majored in chemistry, and I think I believed in God, but I didn't think that there was any reason to believe in God. You just had to more or less bet one way or the other. And my junior year, I was doing really well in school, and I was a part of a social fraternity, the SAE House. So I was doing pretty well in my dating life. I had, a lot of young ladies in my life at different times. So, I was doing okay. But there's no doubt that there was a nagging emptiness in me because I was just the kind of person that asked big questions like, what does all this matter anyway? And in my junior year, some fellows with Campus Crusade, now called Crew, came by my fraternity house and gave a rational presentation for the historical reliability of the New Testament documents and the bodily resurrection of Jesus. Well, I had never even heard of such a thing. And so it shocked me. And I said to myself, if this is really true, this is the greatest news I've ever heard, but I just don't know if it is. So I started meeting with a staff member. He gave me books to read, and I ended up concluding that it was highly likely that this all happened. And so I made it in my mind, I ended up being 75% sure it was true. I wasn't positive, but it was more than I doubted. And so I decided to take that step the third week of November of my junior year in 1968.
Wow.
And it literally was the greatest decision I've ever made. That's not a slogan. It radically turned me around, and I became kind of a radical. I'd get up on free speech platforms.
Wow.
Take the microphone away from Black Panthers that were yelling and screaming, and I'd preach Jesus to them, to all these students around. I got my butt kicked several times because I didn't know what I was talking about. So, but that led me to want to learn more about why I believed what I believed. And I've been walking with Jesus now for 52 years. And I'll be honest with you, I'm as motivated and as excited about my faith as I ever was. Now, my energy level is a little bit lower because I'm older.
Sure.
But I'm still just overjoyed and full of peace and joy. So that's what happened.
Well, that's an awesome story. I love hearing that that you began with such a radical heart for Jesus. Reminds me a lot of my father with that kind of radical nature too. Interestingly enough, I interviewed Gary Habermas not long ago, and he said after he did his dissertation on the resurrection, he actually went through a period where he considered becoming a Buddhist and almost left his faith. Did you ever go through a questioning period like that and significant doubt, or has it been more of a steady experience since becoming a believer?
It's been more of a steady experience, but I've definitely gone through times when I've had doubts. I discovered that most of my doubts were emotionally based, not rationally based. The difference being, if the doubt is really an intellectual one, then you ought to be able to write it down in a paragraph or just be able to state it specifically. If it's emotional doubt, it's kind of just a vague sense of maybe disappointment, maybe that God didn't answer prayers, or he doesn't seem real to you, or you're lonely, or you can't connect with him like you want to. And I think my doubts were more of that nature, though there's no question that I had intellectual doubts. But what I did, Sean, is I had enough integrity to know that if this wasn't true, then I just didn't want to have anything to do with it. And so when I was faced questions that I didn't have an answer for, I did everything. I worked until I found one. And I read, I talked to people that I thought could help me, and I got the vast majority of them answered. And as I grew in the Lord, Sean, a pattern arose where I began to see that when I didn't have an answer to a question, there was somebody out there that did. And what I needed to do was be patient, not throw in the towel, and wait until I found them or found the book. And lo and behold, that's worked. And so I don't have doubts anymore. I just haven't for, I don't know, 10 or 15 years. I just, then I'm not bragging. And I don't think there's anything wrong with people who do. Don't hear me saying that. But I've just been at a point in life where I'm very settled, both emotionally and intellectually. And I don't have doubts any longer.
JP, when I went through a period of questioning in college in the mid-90s, you remember, I met with you in your office, and you said, at that point, which is, 20-some years ago, you said, I've had a lot of questions over my life, but I've done this long enough to know that there's an answer if I'm willing to find it. And I remember thinking, gosh, that must be right. That must be nice, because I don't have that confidence. Now I want to tell you, I remember that decades later, and I don't have all the answers. I'm seeking stuff, but that helped carry me through periods of doubt, knowing that if I would seek it, there would be an answer that was out there. So I remember that well. So one of the other things you taught me is that belief is not just yes or no. It's graded, so to speak. You can have higher percentage of belief. 51% means you believe something, but it's a pretty weak belief. I put on Twitter that I was interviewing you, and somebody said, what percentage would JP Moreland say he's confident that Christianity is true if you were forced to put a percentage on it?
Yeah, well, you have to understand what a percentage means to me, because, I'm 95% sure there's an external world. I am 90% sure that Christianity is true. I actually know it's true. Am I completely certain? No. I don't have any doubts about it, but I don't think that you can achieve that kind of epistemic certainty like you can in mathematics or logic or my own existence. I'm more certain that I exist than that God exists. I am more certain that 2 and 2 is 4, and that if P then Q and P, therefore Q, is a necessary truth of logic than I am that God exists. So they're up there around 98 or 99%. My own existence is pretty much 100%.
Okay.
But Christianity is up at 90, and I'm telling you, that's really high for me. So people have to know that by 90% ranking in my life, that's pretty far up there.
That makes sense. Let me shift a little bit, and we'll come back to the issue about doubt and questions maybe later. What are some of the books that have been most influential in your life, whether books on spiritual disciplines, philosophy, apologetics, whatever?
Well, that's so good. Early on in my Christian life, Norm Geisler's book, Philosophy of Religion and Christian Apologetics, and F. Bruce's book, The New Testament Documents, Are They Historically Reliable? And your dad's book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, all helped me at that time. And as I grew on, I read a New Testament introduction. It's about an 800-page book by Donald Guthrie that talks about the authorship and the dating and form criticism and redaction and all that stuff. And I continued to read works like William Lane Craig and Gary Habermas have done a tremendous amount of good work on bolting down the resurrection for me. But I think in these latter years, the last, I'd say 20 or 30 years, the writings of, in no certain order, of Bill Craig, of Richard Swinburne,
Okay.
of Roger Chisholm, who was a tremendous philosopher, and in the spiritual, and I've kind of kept up with some of the works on the historical Jesus that have been helpful, and there's a number out there. I think a book by Richard Bauckham called The Eyewitnesses, about the Gospels being eyewitness testimony.
Yeah.
Really strong for me. But I think in addition to that, two other things. One would be books on spiritual life. And I would say Dallas Willard's Renovation of the Heart, the book by, my mind is now leaving me, A Celebration of Discipline by Richard Foster.
Okay.
And the Dallas's book on the divine conspiracy. I'm sorry, Sean.
That's okay.
Now, also, books on the supernatural, where you're reading books that are credible accounts of supernatural activity. And I would say one is John Burke's book, Imagine Heaven, which is a very credible book.
Yeah.
About the fact that near-death experiences are biblical, most of them, and there's hard evidence that they're true. And there have been some other books in that area. I have a book that will be coming out in about 10 months with Zondervan. And it's all about documenting 5 different kinds of miracles and telling stories that I personally know about and have verified that show that the miraculous is happening all the time.
Wow.
So those would be books that have been of tremendous encouragement to me. And there are many others, but that comes off the top of my head.
That's a great list. Let us know when that's coming out so we can help spread the word for you. That sounds fascinating. I'm having Dr. Steve Miller on in a few weeks to talk about the evidence for near-death experiences. I know you've read his works. So that's a reminder. For those of you tuning in, make sure you hit the subscribe button. This channel is brought to you by Biola Apologetics. And notifications, because we got some other interviews coming up. And we're here with one of our professors, J.P. Moreland, not so much doing apologetics, but asking some more personal questions about his life. Now, here's a big question I had for you. And you just took a glass, so I think you tipped yourself off. How confident are you that Kansas City is going to repeat for the Super Bowl?
70-30.
Okay.
I just think they have an ability to step it up when the game's on the line, and I think that they were a little bit bored, to be honest with you, with the season. And I think that they won a lot of games with less than a touchdown, and I think that they did what they had to win. So there you have it, dude.
Got it. Love it. Hey, how much time do you spend just reading books and studying? I know we're both professors, so that's kind of worked into our job, but an hour a day, 5 hours a day, how do you specifically carve out time and how much do you read?
Right. It goes in waves. There, because I don't do it uniformly. It depends on if I've got a project I'm working on or if there's a topic I'm really hot on. So, like right now, I'm doing about 4 to 5 hours a day, and I've been doing that for about a year.
Wow.
Uh, because I'm working on a very technical, high level scholarly work on the soul. And I'm reading everything in sight. So I just have gone wild on that. But there are other times when I might, read a couple of times a week for maybe an hour or so. I also will read pretty typically, uh, maybe th- 3 or 4 hours a week on spiritual life books.
Okay.
5 maybe. My wife and I read together every evening.
Hmm.
We read through books with miracle stories and things of that sort. Muslims coming to Christ through Jesus appearing to them, and we get credible ones, and they're very, very encouraging. So it waxes and wanes, and it kind of depends on whether there were other things I've got going. Now, when I was younger, I had more because I had more energy, and I'm 72, so you might want
Hmm.
to keep that in mind.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, in the older days, I mean, I might read 5 or 6 hours a day
Okay.
for 5 days a week, and I did that for maybe 20 years. I don't know, something like that.
I love that in the same sentence you said being wild and reading about the soul. That just captured it. That was awesome.
There you
That's that's great stuff. Um, Here's a question that came through. Tell me about the people who have most shaped your life. You shared about books, but what about the people that most shaped your life?
Well, there are three that stand above anyone else if we're not talking about personal friendships for my wife.
Okay.
And that would be Bill Bright, Howard Hendricks at Dallas Seminary, and the greatest of all was Dallas Willard.
Wow.
And it was Bill's godly character and his faith and his vision. And I got to tell you, I have a group of friends that on the faculty here that were with Crusade in those days in the 60s. And we're still marked by it. I mean,
Hmm.
we are still great. I mean, we never went back on it. We're still Great Commission. We're cause oriented, and we'll all be that way until the day we're dead. It doesn't matter what we're doing for a living. Howard Hendricks was a person that maintained his motivation until the day he dropped dead, and
Wow.
he just was on fire. And he was he worked so hard at what he did that he was just a role model of commitment. Dallas
Hmm.
Willard was probably the smartest person I ever met personally
Hmm.
for any length of time, and the closest thing to Jesus Christ of any human being I've ever had the privilege of meeting. He was the absolute real deal, and
Hmm.
it wasn't perfect, of course, but I'll tell you, the guy marked me, and he loved me, and I loved him, and
Hmm.
that was great. My wife has been, and it's typical to say this because you're supposed to say your wife's wonderful, but my my wife Hope is just she's kind of one of those odd women that just everybody notices her
Hmm.
because she's got a humble heart. She's an evangelist. She's a servant. She's happy every day. I've lived with this woman for approaching 40 years now, and I mean she's just always happy. I'd like to choke her sometimes, but but he's been a great influence on me. And then my friends Bill Roth and the other friends that I've had have been real intimate. Sean, I think it's important to have a group of friends that are, you can say anything you want. They'll get in your face if you need it. You can get in their face, but there's a commitment and a love, and there's an intimacy there. And I've got guy friends that are like that. I've got about 4 or 5, and I just love these guys, and they sustain me, and I sustain them.
That's awesome. One of the things you said about Talbot and Biola and the crew background is one of the things that drew me to study there. Is it was you, William Lane Craig, Horner, Guyvet doing first-rate philosophical work, but an evangelistic heart. And Amen. I think Biola is very unique with that. And it's neat to see that crew has played that influence. Question for you about your desk. I keep something right up here. It's actually a sequoia tree pine cone.
Oh, and my gosh.
Sequoias are the largest trees by volume, but they have the smallest pine cone. And the seed, if you shake them out, is like the size of an oat, like from oatmeal. And it reminds me that small things can have great power. And that was kind of meaningful to me, being a small basketball player, but also just in our world where it feels overwhelming. It's just a reminder that I can make a difference. I'm curious, do you keep anything on your desk that just encourages you, reminds you, inspires you, that you look at regularly?
Yeah, I do. I have this picture. Make sure you can see it.
Yep.
Jesus, can you see that?
Uh-huh.
And it is one of those classic pictures, and it reminds me of how much I love him and need him every day. So I look at this picture. I grew up with it in the Methodist Church, and it just is. It's moving and very touching to me. And then there is one other thing, and that is a picture of my wife when we got married, and wow. she was really hot then, and she is too now, but she is 72, and she can be forgiven for not being like she was then. And it reminds me of just how important family is to me. I have my daughters here, and if you don't mind, I will show you one other thing.
Please.
This is a bottle of wine from Kansas City.
Wow.
And this is Country Club Plaza in Kansas City. And I am a Kansas City boy. I'm a Missouri boy. And I loved growing up there, and it reminds me of my roots. I come from a humble family. My mom and dad were blue-collar workers. They were never full of themselves. If I ever got full of myself, there would be 2 feet inserted in my backside. And so, if I can say this, this may sound terrible, but I've never really had a problem with being prideful or arrogant. I guess one reason is I have to live with myself, and that'll do it. But the other thing is I really get that this is about serving the Lord Jesus. I'm grateful to, if I accomplish something, I enjoy that. I'm not being an idiot. If I do a book or a talk and it went well, I'm very happy about that. But my roots in Missouri gave me kind of some fundamental values about the way to treat other people, and those they were reinforced when I began to get in the Word and became a Christian.
Well, one of the things you've chosen to write on and speak on is mental health issues. Can you tell me why you chose to address that, maybe some of the story behind it, and some of the things you've learned in your research?
Right. Good question. my mom's side of the family, from my grandfather to my mother and two of her sisters, and then to me, and then one of my daughters that clearly looks like me, and my other daughter that looks like Hope doesn't have the problem. But we were all born with a genetic predisposition to anxiety.
Hmm.
And my mom and her sisters were on Valium in the latter part of their lives. And so I was born that way. That doesn't mean I had to become that way, but I had a predisposition. That means it was easier for me to fall into anxiety. Didn't have to, it wasn't determinism. But as I grew up, I was basically okay. In fact, some of the anxiety gave me energy to get with it. But in 2003, I finished a year from hell. I was stressed
Hmm.
beyond belief, and at the end of the school year, I literally had a 7-month nervous breakdown. And it happened to me 10 years later in 2013, uh, after the same kind of year. And I felt like I was losing my mind. I was having almost daily panic attacks. And so I really dedicated myself to not only good Christian counseling and medication, which has been very helpful to me, but also, Sean, to studying everything I could get my hands on. And I must have read 40 books on
Hmm.
anxiety and depression, including this big 400 and some page standard guide for psychiatrists and psychologists. I read that. And I boiled down what I learned to a set of ideas that I committed myself to putting into practice. So when I wrote that book, it was really an attempt to share with others things that I had proven worked for me, because I waited until they worked, and so that's what happened.
Hmm.
And I haven't had problems with anything like that for 7 years. Uh,
Wow.
but the main thing I learned, and this is a keeper, it's in my book, Finding Quiet, but the main thing I learned is that not all the time, but most of the time, anxiety is a learned habit that you can unlearn by doing the right practices. So it takes practicing certain things day by day that disengroove those anxiety triggering grooves in your brain and nervous system, and replacing them with healthy grooves that trigger peace and joy just automatically as their default position. So I think habit formation and habits of the way I talk to myself. Am I half full or half
Hmm.
empty? Well, I was more than half empty, but now I'm half full and more. But you can't just will yourself to be there. You've got to practice certain things that I list in my book that will get you there over a few months if you stay with it. And that's what happened and why I did that. And I guess I think that we lose a lot of people to the faith or to effective ministry and a vibrant Christian life, not as certainly by doubts and ideas, but also by their emotional instability and their fragmentation,
Hmm.
maybe from their childhood. And so I wanted to just strengthen and kind of support my brothers and sisters from the things that had certainly helped me.
JP, I have not read near as much on mental health issues as you have, but as I read Gen Z and follow kind of the data, pretty much every expert I'm seeing is talking about how the concern with mental health issues, depression, anxiety, loneliness, skyrocketing during the quarantine. Do you think, does that match up with, and I could guess, but tell us why, if that's so, you think that would be the case?
Oh, very much so. There are several reasons why anxiety and depression have been on the rise for about 20 years. One of them is the pace at which we live our lives.
Hmm.
It's too rapid. We weren't made for that. Second is the inordinate individualism, where we don't have close friends and have community and regular, we don't know how to attach to them. I think the third one was a loss of meaning and purpose in life as the main thing that guides us. And so I think what happens is that's gone on today. And the COVID situation not only has caused people to be afraid about dying
Hmm.
or getting significantly sick or losing a loved one, but I think more than that, and losing your job. I mean, that's all understandable. But I think more than that, it's caused people to have to slow down and be quiet. And that's really hard to do if you're used to being adrenalized by activity. So you can actually go through more anxiety when you're in a quiet stage if you don't embrace it and work
Hmm.
through it and learn to make it your friend. Because what you'll do is turn to addictive behaviors to give you a little soothing, and then that just is a Turkish delight situation where you're going to get worse and worse as time goes on. So
Hmm.
that's what I think happens. It exposed the fact that we were coping by being busy and being on these technology gadgets all the time. And God bless them, but they're good for us, but not all the time. That's what I think happened.
That's really helpful. That's great. By the way, JP, I haven't read them to you, but there's a number of people commenting on your books and ministry that have just been very meaningful and encouraging to them. I want to make
Oh,
sure you heard.
thank you. Well, I want to
Um,
say thank you to all of you. Thank you.
One of the things you've shared a few times when I had you in a mentoring group, I've heard you speak, and in class, is that you didn't grow up with a father, and that did have a big effect on your life. Would you be willing to share what that father vacuum, for lack of a better term, was like, and just how that's affected you in your life and your ministry?
Well, my father got sick with cancer when I was 6 months old. He had radical surgery, which in those days you could do,
Hmm.
meaning that you didn't have anything to lose. You were going to die anyway. So they tried this surgery, which might have killed him in the operating table, but it actually helped him. And then he ended up dying when I was in second grade. So my mom remarried 5 years later in seventh grade to a wonderful man, but he didn't really know how to relate to me very well. He was kind. But what happened was I felt I didn't really know how to be a man, what a man looked like. Uh, I I felt unprotected.
Hmm.
I remember going to this Cub Scout meeting, and my mom dropped me off at the church door where they were having it, and I walked into this room, and there were like 80 kids in there, and they all had dads.
Hmm.
And here are these big men, and I don't know what I'm supposed to do. And I'm walking around, and I'm just wanting to cry and run out of there because I didn't have anybody that was overseeing me, and I felt very vulnerable. So I think it made me have a feeling of inadequacy uh, that vacuum created. Now, here's the good news. The good news is that my senior year, I was athlete of the year, and I was all conference 2 years at first team in basketball and all district in football. Had scholarships to play both at small schools. Played baseball and track, and so I had coaches. And God surrounded me with some really wonderful coaches that were good men, and I modeled my life after these men, and they were all the kind of men that you'd want to model your life of. Many of them were believers, which I didn't really understand, but they were just good role models. You know, understand? So God filled the vacuum with other men.
Hmm.
The other thing was this: I was raised by my mom, and what that did for me is that and I'm not bragging, I'm just telling the truth as best I can. I've taken tests on emotional intelligence, and I'm really high on emotional intelligence. I score very high on 5 different scales, and that means I'm pretty good interpersonally, and I'm a good listener. I don't take all the air out of a room when I walk in. And the reason is because my mom, I was raised by a woman, and
Hmm.
women tend to be better at that kind of sensitivity than men.
Hmm.
And so the benefit was that I got the wonderful influence of my precious mom, and it actually was a good thing in that way. So God can bring good out of bad, and I'm proof of that.
Hmm.
God saved me, but it's tough to be fatherless.
Sure. I really appreciate your honesty, JP. Ever since I've known you, you've been vulnerable, and it's meaningful to me personally. You know, my dad grew up a father who was in the home, but who was drunk all the time, who
Oh,
was abusive, distant. And before he was a believer, people would say, "You have a heavenly father," and he'd be like, "Why would I want a heavenly father? Father equals drunk, abusive." And there was a
yeah.
lot of relational and intellectual rewiring. How did that shape your spiritual life? And do you think that's a barrier to people coming to the faith? Or do you think the fact that there is a father in the faith is more of a draw for people? Or is it some mix of both?
Yeah, I think there's one of the Psalms that says that you're God speaking to his people, and it says, "You thought I was just like you."
Hmm.
And we tend to project on God our own who we are. And the most formative influence on a person's God view is the father. That the mother plays a role, of course, but my view is men and women are different. They're better at different roles. I don't absolutize that. I'd be glad to have a woman president, but they're just seem to be naturally gifted. And as a result, I think the father is a little bit more influential in shaping that picture of God. Now,
Hmm.
for me, since my father was absent, I think that I I might have had a little. I had more difficulty in my first, let's just say, 7 or 8 years as a believer, connecting with God. He
Hmm.
seemed absent from me more than he has for the last 40 some years,
Hmm.
because I was not expecting him to be present. So I think uh, that was a part of a problem for me in terms of my picture of God. And what I had to do is I had to really zero in on Jesus and not the Father as much.
Hmm.
And that got me through. But now I've come to realize that I've been prepared for an explicit investigation of the Father's love.
Hmm.
And and embracing His love over the last, I don't know, 15 years
Hmm.
has really enriched me, if I may say so. But it wasn't as easy as it would have been for someone who had a nurturing and a protective father who was strong and
Hmm.
made you feel safe and was available to you.
Hmm. Thanks for sharing openly and honestly. When I work with students, you know, I still teach a high school class part time. Fatherlessness is it's huge, and it
Oh,
affects kids on so many levels. Let me shift gears somewhat. You have 2 daughters who are grown, out of the home. So you're obviously a parent, still a parent. If you were going to go back and start over parenting, what are some things that you've just learned that say, you know what, I might do this differently or emphasize that a little bit? If you had a parenting do over, so to speak, what might it look like now that you're a few years removed from having kids in the home?
um, well, for me, when I got married, I wanted daughters. I just am a
Hmm.
daughter daddy, and sons would have been wonderful, but I asked God to give me girls because I just love little girls. They're
Hmm.
just fun and they're frilly and they do these little things where they wear all these costumes and have tea parties, and I love that. And so, to be honest, I really gave my heart and soul to fathering and doing reading and practicing and talking to people. I had a good course on Christian marriage with Howard Hendricks at Dallas. So I don't have very many regrets. There are two
Hmm.
things though that I would say. First is I would try not to be ang- angry with the girls so quickly. I mean, there were times
Hmm.
when I got hacked off, and I said, I was thinking to myself, what? Whose kid are you? I mean, what is that? And and I would come at them in a way that was too strong.
Hmm.
And I wish I hadn't done that. I wish I would have been a person who worked harder on taking a deep breath and
Hmm.
doing things like that before I talk to them about something. Probably the single biggest issue that I wished I had done differently isn't with them, it's with my wife.
Hmm.
Uh, the biggest conflicts in our marriage were during those years when the girls were, I'd say, from sixth grade up through the first year to a college, because we had really different approaches. We have the same values, we have very different approaches. And she's much more. Here's an example. I mean, my daughter was a first girl at Esperanza High School, my daughter Ashley, to be on the varsity cheer squad 4 years in a row.
Wow.
She made it as a freshman, and her senior year, or her junior year, there was the varsity tight end who wanted to take her out on a date. Well, no, that was just not going to work for me because I knew what he was thinking, and my wife just jumped all over me. I mean, first of all, I said no, and if my daughter had had a knife, she would have cut my head off without thinking about it, or clawed my eyes out. She was enraged.
Hmm.
Well, my wife, as was typical, jumped on their side, and so now I'm against three women. And I eventually gave up because I thought, well, this isn't worth fighting about.
Hmm.
But I did have a strong talk with her, and my daughters were virgins when they got married,
Hmm.
and I'm grateful. I'm proud of that. It's okay if some of our viewers weren't. I wasn't, because I was an unbeliever for a good while. But so that's not to harm anybody, but I'm just proud of them being that way. But I wish that we'd gone to counseling and
Hmm.
tried to work out how we could resolve our differences in issues without getting on
Hmm.
each other's case and in raising the decibel level.
Sure. Sure.
One thing that I wish I had done differently.
Hmm. I appreciate that. That's awesome to hear you say how much you poured yourself into being a dad. Not a lot of regrets. I hope when I get to the end, I can look back and say, you know what, I tweaked this or that, but as a whole, poured myself into it. I think
Yeah,
that's where we should be with honest reflection. So I'm
thank you.
thrilled to hear you say that. One question that somebody had, more of kind of a writing question, is why did you first choose to write on the soul and consciousness? And then how do you choose what to research and write and focus on?
Well, I began to uh, see a growing number of Christian scholars, and this took place, I'm going to guess, about 30 years ago, uh, who were abandoning the idea of a soul
Hmm.
and just saying that we were our bodies and brains, but we had emergent consciousness. And I that didn't make any sense to me. And you know, one guy, Richard Bube at Stanford, said that when we die, we cease to exist, but we are continued in existence as a memory in God's mind. Well, I thought, dude, you know, it's nice that people remember you, and it's nice that God remembers me, but that ain't me in His mind, or else I'd be a constituent of His intellect, you know, and I'm not part of God. Now, so a memory of me is not me, and I couldn't figure out how there could be an intermediate state between death and resurrection where I existed in a disembodied state if I didn't have a soul. And on it goes. And so I began to realize that we were giving up territory to the emerging naturalism and materialism of science. And I didn't think it was needed. I thought that there was no sense in this. And so I began to research it and teach on it. And I realized the more I looked into it, that the evidence that consciousness isn't physical and that there is an immaterial soul is, in my opinion, overwhelming. It's not like it's 55-45.
Wow.
You know, it's 20. And for me, that's pretty far up there. And so I wanted to set the record straight, and I knew that I had the horsepower to do it. And so I wanted to fight back and to write a book that countered the encroachment of materialism and naturalism, with the result that we were constantly revising our theology to make the scientists happy with us. And that just ain't who I am. You know, I'm not gonna go that route. I picked things to write based on a couple of criteria. Number one, is this a need
Good.
that is out there? Is this something where the church needs help? And the secular world is grossly misunderstanding what we actually believe about this subject and why. Two, am I passionate about this? Because if I'm not, then that's an important issue, but maybe it's for somebody else. So what are my passions? And three, do I have the ability to address this subject? Or could I get up to speed on it? So need, passion, and do I have the ability to address it? So I would say that, you know, love God and do what you please, as Augustine said. That's kind of how I've approached it. And I've been just putting out brush fires and trying to deal with things and put my, you know, finger in the dike and keep the dike from breaking, and maybe even mobilize other people to get involved.
That's amazing. When I was picking a dissertation, it was, can I do this? Is there a genuine need? And am I passionate about it? It was those exact three criteria. And unless you planted that in my subconscious and I forgot it, that's pretty cool to hear. That's a similar. Let me ask you one question I'm curious about. I asked this to Bill Craig, and I'd be curious what you would say. Do you have a favorite book of the Bible?
Yes. It would have to be, if I may, Luke Acts. Luke is my favorite gospel, although you know, Matthew's in there too, and I love all of them. But if you asked me to pin one down on an island, I'd take Luke. And the Book of Acts is right there and is one of my very favorite books in the whole Bible. And the reason is this: that book, every time I read it, I am overwhelmingly impressed about its historical accuracy, and these things really did happen. Now, what that does for me is it increases my expectations that they will happen today. And so I find it faith inspiring. Second tier would probably be the Book of Psalms,
Huh.
uh, which would be up there, and then if in Paul's writings, probably either First Corinthians or Philippians.
Very, very, very interesting. I love to hear you say it. Now that you describe it, it makes sense that Luke, Acts, and we can combine those together, would fit, since he's a doctor and intellectual and gives a
Yeah.
lot of facts to study. Plus, the radicalness of Acts 2 always motivates me in my faith. How do you deal with criticism? I know right now it's probably not in person because of the quarantine, but over the years in your debates, in writings, you've received a lot of criticism from within the church for your stance on mental health issues. I've heard say this is compromise. From outside the faith, some have criticized you. What's your approach when you're criticized?
Well, um, it's changed over the years. I think it bothered me more early on, but after a while, you get used to it. And
Hmm.
Dallas Willard told me, if you don't want anybody to criticize you, then just don't say anything significant. And he's right. So I just am not willing to make that trade off, and I'm gonna. So I'm the kind of person that is willing to hear arguments against what I believe. I read them, try to give them a fair assessment, and I make my students do that. Well, so I don't mind somebody giving me a hard hitting critique of a position I've taken. That's fair. But when they start assaulting me or using ad hominems and making things that are cheap shots that you don't need to do that.
Hmm.
I'm at the point where, first of all, it doesn't bother me because I don't care. It's so much work for them. I mean, if they have to stoop to that kind of stuff, that shows my arguments are pretty good. And I find that kind of thing, I just chalk it up to the sad situation we're in the culture today.
Hmm.
Now, if I get criticized by somebody I love, a close friend, uh, for example, that's harder
Hmm.
unless it is done in an honest, truthful spirit with an aim of building me up in the long run. Now that still hurts. It's embarrassing.
Sure.
It still hurts. I don't like it, but I know that I'm going to work through that because I know why so and so did this. He's not against me. He's for me. But if you get one where it's kind of, even one of your friends, is kind of hacked off at you and he gives you a cheap shot, that hurts. That doesn't happen a lot, but those kind of get, because I love this person and I know, what are you doing? I get enough of that out there, and I
Hmm.
don't look at it anymore. I mean, I just say it's not a good idea. I know another scholar who's a real good friend of mine, and he spent an awful lot of time reading criticisms of his pieces and trying to answer everybody. And I saw just the agitation it brought in his soul, and I understood why he did it. But that wasn't for me. I decided that I would argue out my stuff in the journals and in the books and so on, and so I don't look at that stuff. I don't Google my name
Hmm.
because all kinds of crap comes up. So I'm just not.
That there's a lot of wisdom to that. That makes sense.
Yeah.
I can find it starts expending not only time but emotional energy too, and can affect me in negative ways. Although I want to be aware of criticisms when
Oh yeah.
appropriate. So it's a tough balance. So I think that's great advice. We got time for probably just a couple more questions, but let me ask you kind of briefly, what was the story behind the MA philosophy program and why you came to Biola? Because I've shared this with you that I went to Biola as an undergrad, awesome, did my doctorate at Southern Baptist. But that time from 2000 to about 2003, when I was in the MA Phil program, my wife, who knew me at that time, we were high school sweethearts even beforehand, described that as the greatest transformation she had seen in my life, basically since junior high, knowing me. And I could give all the reasons for that. I won't. But what's the quick story behind that program? And for those, the MA Phil is the MA Philosophy program at Talbot, which is a part of Biola.
I had a burden to create something that would multiply my impact and train up others to do what I did. Either go into the church or parachurch ministries, or just have a regular job but be effective in their church, or go on for PhDs and teach and make a difference. But there needed to be a university that had a chance to be a real academically respected university because of the quality of their work, not because of caving in, and also valued the Great Commission and evangelism of the spiritual life. And Biola had a shot at that. I saw that. So I was invited to come and join the faculty with no promise that we could start this thing. But Scott Ray, who is the bioethicist and general ethicist in our program, was finishing up his doctorate in ethics at USC. And we were already buddies. We knew each other from seminary. And so we wanted to try to get a program going. So we went to McDonald's and we got out actually a napkin. And we said, if we wanted a curriculum, what would we do? And we wrote out a curriculum on this thing of the courses we thought needed to be in that thing. And we typed it up and took it to the dean, and he bought it. And he said, we got to see if you can have students now. And so we'll give you, 4 years. And so we had 12 the first year and then 30 the next year. And then it got up to 130 for a while. And it was the biggest MA program in the world. And we pumped 220 students in PhD programs. And many of them, like you, are teaching and writing and doing other things. So it was the burden to combine a heart for spiritual life and evangelism and impact for Christ with a well-developed mind and an articulate ability to spell out the Christian faith into the culture. And that's what we tried to do. Tried to love Jesus and be real in our journey, but also be tough-minded.
I had never heard the piece about McDonald's that you went and sat down and wrote it there. When my dad tells the story about writing evidence, he took a couple folders, sat in a McDonald's, and then went back to his room and finished it up. So that's kudos. McDonald's has inspired some good apologetic and philosophy. Hey, for those of you watching, a couple of the books that came up today, I would really encourage you to get two that I've loved and benefited from by JP. One is a book just called The Soul. If you're looking for an explanation of what the soul is and a defense of substance dualism, you will not find a better book than simply called The Soul. And we had an interview earlier. If you just search JP, my name, and evidence for the soul, we kind of walk through that if it's helpful. And then his book, Finding Quiet, where he really lays out a practical plan for spiritual growth tied to what he discussed earlier in terms of combating anxiety and some other issues as well. Finding Quiet is a book that you'll definitely want to pick up. Make sure you hit the subscribe button. We actually have an interview. We don't normally do this, but tomorrow we have Michael Behe coming on, and he's going to talk about his latest book, where he's really defending pretty much the arguments he's laid out there from the flagellum and from the edge of evolution. And I'm going to lay the toughest questions out there for him and see if he can defend intelligent design. I know he can, but that's tomorrow at noon. So make sure you hit subscribe. Make sure you hit the notification button, because we'd love to have you join us tomorrow. Believer or not, bring your tough questions. And I know Dr. Behe will want to be ready to answer those. And just very quickly, this channel is brought to you by Biola Apologetics. We'd love to have you join us in the MA Philosophy program that JP is talking about. It is a full distance program. And in the MA Apologetics program, there's information below. Check it out. We'd love to have you at Biola. JP, hang on just for a minute, but thanks so much for coming on. And this is a great, stimulating conversation. If you enjoyed it, consider sharing it with a friend. Everybody have a great night. Thanks so much for being here with us.